When Cambyses, the ruler of Persia, died, he left the throne to his son Bardiya. However, in the space of a short year, he was killed under suspicious circumstances, and a Persian noble of royal blood named Darius seized the throne for himself. Afterwards, he toured the empire, crushing multiple revolts and generally solidifying his rule over the many provinces, or satrapies as the Persians called them. 6 years or so later, he organized and led an expedition to conquer the Indus Valley and returned victorious. Then he set his sights on Europe, and just 3 years after his last expedition, marched for Thrace. He conquered the Thracian tribes and accepted the submission of the local Greek mainland and island states, including the Kingdom of Macedon, which submitted without a fight. He then crossed the Danube and invaded Scythia to subjugate the nomadic tribes ahead. After playing cat and mouse with these tribes for a while, and faced with a supply problem, he returned to Anatolia for some rest. But then, in 499 B.C.E., the Greek cities in Asia Minor revolted, in what is now known as the Ionian Revolt. When they asked the mainland Greeks for support, they turned a deaf ear. Only Athens and the small city of Eretria sent a token force of 25 warships in total. Despite this, the revolt lasted 6 long years, until it was finally put down. After such an eventful set of years, as Darius was probably preparing for some rest, his servant reminded him of some unfinished business. Athens and Eretria had to be punished. So, preparations were made, and an expedition by land and sea was sent. While the fleet was rounding the first of 3 peninsulas in northern Greece, a huge storm beset them, and, we are told, the whole fleet was destroyed. Almost simultaneously, the land army encountered stiff resistance from the local Thracian tribes, suffering many casualties. When they learned what happened to the fleet, they immediately abandoned the expedition. Back in Persia, when Darius was having his supper and learned of this, he was probably not happy. He ordered all great coastal cities in his empire to assemble their fleets and meet with the rest of the army. Darius put a guy called Datis in charge of the fleet, which we are told was about 600 ships strong, and his own nephew, Artaphernes, in charge of the land army. This totaled to about 25,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry, although as always, you should take these numbers with a grain of salt. Surely these 2 guys could take care of 2 small Greek cities, while Darius has some well-deserved rest. Persian infantry were in general lightly armored, and in consequence highly mobile. They were drawn from all parts of his empire: Anatolian and Iranian hillmen, fierce Sakai tribesmen, and strong Akkadians. As a result, they were armed with very diverse weapons, from spears and axes to bows. What they lacked in military training, they made up for with a hardy lifestyle in their homelands, their diversity, and numbers. All preparations being made, the army embarked and set sail for Greece. Back in Athens, as soon as word was out that the Persians were coming, the city assembled its army, 1,000 men from each of the 10 Athenian tribes, totaling 10,000, all of them citizen soldiers. The Athenians, like all Greeks at this time, fought as hoplites. These, unlike the Persians, were heavily armored. They carried a big shield and a 2.5 meter or 8-foot spear. Although they were not professional soldiers, they did serve a 2-year military training program as soon as they had reached adulthood, which drilled them in the maneuvers of the phalanx formation. To lead this army, the Athenians had 10 strategoi, or generals. These were usually elected from among the aristocracy and served 1-year terms. Also with them was another official, the polemarch, which translates roughly to war archon, or war magistrate. We know that, Contrary to the generals, he was chosen at random, with every citizen being eligible. Most of the time, this probably meant he had no military experience, but the Athenians believed that random election was the best sort of representation. In any case, his role in the army is still debated. Some scholars argue he was in overall command, but the traditional view, given to us by Herodotus, and generally accepted, is contrary to this. Bear with me. Each of the generals took charge of the army for a period of 1 day, after which the command passed to the next in line. This may seem like a terrible idea. What if the generals could not agree on a common plan? The army would be left running in circles, trying to attack on one day, march south on the other, and hold their ground on yet another, as strategy changed each day along with the general. To avoid this exact situation, overall strategy was set by the war council. The generals, along with the war archon, gathered, and each one of them took turns to argue for a particular strategy. After the discussion was over, they cast a vote, and the proposal with the majority was chosen. After that point, the decision was binding, and each general had to follow the overall strategy set by the council while still retaining tactical command of the army. At around this time, the Athenians also thought best to send a messenger to Sparta to ask for their assistance, as they were the strongest of all the Greek states and seemed a natural ally. The Spartans said they were celebrating a religious festival, the Carneia, and that warfare was thus not permitted to them. They did, however, state that as soon as these celebrations were done, they would send help. This may sound as an excuse, and it may have been one, but the Spartans were known to be deeply pious. Meanwhile, in the small city of Eretria, the citizens were debating whether to put up a fight or leave the city and literally run to the hills. In the end, they decided to stay and defend the city's walls as best they could, and a message was sent to Athens asking for assistance. The Athenians had a few years ago settled 4,000 men in a city called Chalkis, close to Eretria, and these were now sent to aid them. It seems that at this time, word started to spread that a pro-Persian conspiracy was brewing inside the city's walls, and when the Athenians heard of this, they promptly left the Eretrians to their own fate. As soon as the Persians arrived, they set up the siege, and not long after, we are told, the conspiracy was set into action, and the gates were opened by traitors. The city was burned to the ground. The citizens who survived were taken as slaves. This being done, the Persians once more embarked on their ships and sailed for the Athenian coast. They arrived at a place called Marathon and made landing. The plain there was wide and unbroken, if not for a medium-sized marsh to the northeast. It was limited on all sides by rising hills and the sea, with only 3 exits. One to the northwest led to the small city of Rhamnus, one of many such cities in Athenian territory. To the east, a hill road cut through the mountains, and to the south there was another road between the mountains and the sea, both of them leading to Athens. Datis and Artaphernes chose this site well. The promontory, known to the Greeks as Kinosura, or the Dog's Tail, shielded the Persian beached ships from the rough sea, while the marsh protected their initial beachhead and camp. The vast plain allowed them to use the superior numbers and cavalry at their disposal to full effect, should a set-piece battle take place. There was one catch, and you have probably guessed it: the hill between the 2 roads. If the Athenians were to deploy there, it would hand them control of both passages, and force the Persians to engage uphill. Were the Persian commanders overconfident about their army's strength? Or did they already have a plan to force the Athenians out of the hill? We will attempt to answer this question shortly, so keep it in mind. Anyway, the Athenians, marching up the hill road, as expected, promptly deployed in that same hill between the 2 exits that led to Athens. This was the Heraklion, and it was said to be, since ancient times, sacred to Heracles. At this point, probably to their amazement, a group of 1,000 hoplites appeared over the mountains and marched towards the Athenians. These men were from a small city called Plataea, just outside Athenian territory. They came, they said, to help against the Persians. Considering the size of their city, they had probably raised all their available men. The Athenians were beyond grateful and enthusiastically accepted them into their ranks. Soon after their arrival, the Athenian leadership was faced with a dilemma and was divided on which course to take. Miltiades, who was, we are told, the most experienced of the strategoi, proposed an immediate attack. His reasoning was that if the army was stationed at Marathon, the city was defenseless, and the Persians could take a small contingent of men on their ships and sail directly to Athens. As if this wasn't enough of a risk, there were many among the Athenian aristocracy who were willing to submit to Persia, especially those of the Alcmaeonid clan, one of the most well-off families in the city. If the Persians enacted this plan, the gates could very well be wide open. However, Miltiades' suspicions did not convince all the generals. Some argued that leaving the hill and attacking the larger Persian army in the plain was suicidal. They were in the high ground, blocking both exits to Athens. Furthermore, the Persians would, sooner or later, run out of supplies and be forced to engage them uphill. It is easy to see that this proposal took into consideration all the Athenian advantages, while Miltiades' proposal gambled them because of a single fear: a pro-Persian conspiracy in Athens, or in other words, treason. The question is, was it a real threat? The answer proves fundamental to understanding prior and following events, so let's take a moment to look at it. The conspiracy would explain Datis and Artaphernes' disregard for the Athenian defensive position, as it would be worthless to them once Athens was taken behind their back. It would also be in line with the prior events at Eretria, when the Persians bribed influential townsfolk to open the gates of the city. It is not far-fetched to think that some in Athens would gladly aid the Persians. After all, they brought with them a former Athenian tyrant called Hippias, with the aim of installing him as a puppet ruler. Many among the city's aristocracy would benefit from getting in Hippias' good side. Our main source, Herodotus, goes to great lengths to defend a specific aristocratic family, the Alcmaeonids, from any guilt in this conspiracy. Seeing that he wrote his text in a time when this family's influence in Athenian politics was growing, it is highly likely that he was either bribed by them to do so, or received those reports from a pro-Alcmaeonid source. Finally, it was Miltiades, the most experienced of the generals, that proposed a plan which disregarded all tactical considerations in favor of swift action. Being the most veteran, we can safely assume that the Athenian position's advantages were not lost on him, and that he acted with this conspiracy in mind. If this is true, we can assume that the Alcmaeonids had already contacted the Persians and informed them that on their signal they could march to Athens and the gates would be open. Back in the Athenian camp, the matter was finally put to a vote, and we are told the generals were equally divided, with each of the proposed strategies receiving 5 votes. The time came for the war magistrate, Callimachos, to make the deciding vote. Miltiades is said to have told him, "Everything now rests on you." The fact that he voted in favor of attacking, alongside half the generals, is probably evidence enough that treason back in Athens was a very real threat. In response to this result, Aristides, one of the supporters of Miltiades' strategy, laid down his day in command to him. This had the intended result. All the other generals followed suit, leaving Miltiades in full command of the army. Contrary to what we could expect, Miltiades didn't attack immediately. There was still the hope that the Spartans would arrive in time, and if this was possible before an engagement, then great. Although he was now the sole commander of the army, he would wait a period of 10 days, until his designated day in command, to make time for the Spartans to show up. For 9 days, the Athenians deployed on the hills. while the Persians offered battle on the open plain, seeing no reason to march on the well-defended Athenian position. Besides, they just had to wait for the signal. Conveniently, on the night of the 9th day, a signal was seen flashing atop one of the many hills. The Alcmeonids, it seems, were ready. Datis ordered all the cavalry to embark on their ships. He would lead the contingent that would take Athens, while Artaphernes stayed behind with all the infantry. According to Herodotus, upon learning of this, a group of Ionian Greeks fighting for the Persians deserted to the Athenian side and informed them of what was happening. It was now imperative that the Athenians gain a quick victory and march back to Athens before the enemy got there. But Miltiades still had two big problems. Although cavalry was no longer a threat to his flanks, the Persians still had a vast numerical superiority, and so their battle line stretched much wider than the Athenian one. If both armies engaged, the Persian flanks could easily envelop the Greeks. To counter this, Miltiades lined up his flanks with those of the enemy, and then ordered the hoplites on the center to deploy in a thinner line to cover more ground. In this way, although his center was weaker, his flanks were no longer exposed. As mentioned earlier, many of the Persians were armed with bows as primary or secondary weapons. If the Athenian phalanx moved at its usual slow pace, once in range of the Persian archers, it would get showered by volleys of arrows before it even got close to the enemy line. To solve this problem, Miltiades came up with a very unusual solution. The phalanx, he ordered, should advance at its usual slow pace, but as soon as it got in range of Persian archers, it should charge the final distance. This, well, it goes against all canon of Greek warfare. A phalanx, by definition, is an organized, slow-moving formation of heavily armored infantrymen. Its strength lies mainly in its cohesion, as the hoplites slowly march together, their shields overlapping, and present a wall of spears to their enemy. Miltiades' gamble was that the distance was relatively short and would not allow for much loss of cohesion. The genius of Miltiades lies in his pragmatic thinking, both before the battle, when he had predicted Persian treason, and now as he was giving out orders for deployment. At every point, he had tried to eliminate his weaknesses and magnify his strengths. As morning dawned, the order to advance was given. The Plataeans were posted on the left flank, with the rest of the Athenian tribes in their usual order, each one commanded by its corresponding general. Callimachos, the war magistrate, was stationed at the position of honor, the right flank. The Persians stood their ground, waiting for them to enter the range of their archers. According to plan, the whole army charged the final distance, which seems to have caught Artaphernes by surprise. The battle was fought hardest in the center, where the numerically superior Persians forced the Athenians to give ground. On the flanks, however, the opposite was happening, as the more armored and densely packed hoplites pushed the enemy back. Finally, the forward momentum of the hoplite phalanx proved too much for the Persians under pressure on the flanks, and so they broke. Instead of pursuing, the Plataeans and Athenians turned back and crashed on the flanks of the Persian center, which could not withstand the pressure and broke completely. Do you see the irony here? In an attempt to avoid Persian encirclement, Miltiades had done exactly the opposite. One can wonder if the Carthaginian general Hannibal was a fan of his. Anyway, the Greeks pursued the Persians to their ships, killing hundreds before they eventually escaped. After several hours of battle, the Athenians forced marched back to Athens, and as the Persian contingent sent to capture the city arrived on the shore and saw the Athenian army waiting for them, they immediately understood what had happened. Needless to say that the pro-Persians in Athens were eager to show their happiness for the great victory in Marathon. According to our sources, 6,400 Persians were killed, most during their desperate run to their ships, while the Athenians lost only 192 men. This result must have sounded like a miracle, as news spread around Greece. The small Athenian state had single-handedly outnumbered 3-1, defeated the greatest empire in the world. The Spartans finally arrived a few days later, and when told that the Persians had been dealt with, they were amazed. They marched all the way to Marathon to inspect the bodies, gave congratulations to the Athenians, and marched back home. The proud Athenians raised a column in the Acropolis in honor of Callimachos and the dead, which has survived to our day. Carved in marble is the following inscription: Callimachos of Aphidna dedicated me to Athena, messenger of the immortals who have homes on Olympus. Callimachos, the polemarch of the Athenians, who fought the battle at Marathon for the Greeks, for the children of the Athenians, a memorial. We are told that Darius began yet again preparations for an invasion that he planned to finally lead himself. This time, Athens could not stand alone.